They told her to stay in the jump seat. No pilot license, no command authority, just a clipboard marked Flight Operations Observer and a cockpit she was forbidden to control. As pre-flight checks commenced and crew members exchanged practiced banter, she sat quietly, absorbing more than anyone realized. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 23 minutes later, when both pilots collapsed from sudden illness and panic filled the cabin of Flight 447, everything changed. The Boeing 737 carrying 200 souls had only one person left who truly understood how to bring it home safely. The employee break room at Denver International Airport hummed with the constant white noise of fluorescent lights and brewing coffee. Maya Rodriguez sat alone at a corner table, her regulation navy blazer crisp despite the early morning hour. The nameplate on her chest read Flight Operations Coordinator in small, precise letters. Around her, pilot uniforms dominated the space for gold bars catching the harsh lighting. Conversation flowing in aviation shorthand she understood, but wasn't invited to join. Captain Bradley Morrison leaned against the vending machine, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of 15,000 flight hours. The weather's looking sketchy over Kansas City. Might need to bump altitude early on the 447. His co-pilot nodded, adjusting the wings pin on his uniform. Neither man glanced toward Maya's table. She kept her eyes on the flight manifest spreadsheet, but her peripheral vision caught every gesture, every technical reference. The 737-800 they'd be operating had a history of slight hydraulic lag in the primary flight controls, a detail buried in maintenance logs that most pilots skimmed. She'd read every service bulletin for that aircraft twice. First Officer David Chun entered the break room, still fastening his tie. "Rodriguez, you're writing an observer today, right?" He didn't wait for her answer. "Try not to ask too many questions." During departure, "The sim jockeys always want to know why we do everything." Maya nodded once. She'd heard variations of this comment dozens of times. In the 18 months since she'd started flying as an operations observer, the assumption never changed. She was there to learn the basics, to watch real pilots do real work, to maybe understand a fraction of what aviation actually required. What they didn't know was that Maya held a commercial pilot certificate with instrument and multi-engine ratings. What they didn't know was that she'd accumulated over 800 hours in various aircraft before budget cuts eliminated her position at Rocky Mountain Flight Academy. What they absolutely didn't know was that she'd been studying the specific procedures for emergency single-pilot operations on commercial aircraft, not because anyone asked her to, but because she couldn't stop herself from learning. The crew briefing room adjacent to the break area filled with the morning's flight teams. Maya followed at a respectful distance, her leather portfolio containing copies of weather reports, UNOTAMIS, and alternate airport information she'd compiled before dawn. Captain Morrison conducted the briefing with efficient professionalism, covering route details, passenger load, and fuel calculations. "Passenger count is 198 plus crew," he announced, consulting his tablet. "Weight and balance looks good. The weather's clear until we hit the Missouri border, then we're looking at possible turbulence." His eyes swept the room, but passed over Maya without acknowledgement. She opened her portfolio and compared his fuel figures to her own calculations. The numbers matched, but she'd also run scenarios for 3 additional alternate airports he hadn't mentioned. The approach plates for those fields were already bookmarked in her manual, a habit that had cost her money but never failed to prepare her for conversations she was never part of. During the drive to the aircraft, Maya rode in the crew van's back seat while the pilots discussed a colleague's recent upgrade to captain. Their conversation moved between technical topics and company politics with the ease of people who belonged. She listened to their assessment of the day's passenger load, their casual dismissal of weather forecasts, their assumptions about what the flight would require. These milk runs to Chicago are basically autopilot exercises, First Officer Chun said, scrolling through his phone. Set it and forget it, Captain Morrison chuckled. Just don't let the FAA hear you say that during a check ride. Maya made no comment, but she thought about the 17 different scenarios that could disable autopilot systems, the manual flying. Skills that atrophied without practice, the muscle memory required to hand-fly a transport category aircraft in degraded conditions. She'd practiced those scenarios in simulation until her arms ached, paying for extra time with money she couldn't afford to spend. The Boeing 737-800 sat at Gate B-27, its fuselage gleaming under the terminal's floodlights. Ground crews moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, conducting final inspections and loading procedures. Maya approached the boarding ramp behind the flight crew, her observer badge clearly visible, but somehow making her less visible to everyone around. Her flight attendant supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, greeted the pilots with familiar warmth. "Good morning, Captain Morrison. David, we've got a full house today, couple of connecting international flights feeding into this one." She glanced at Maya's badge and offered a polite but distant smile. "Observer today, Maya Rodriguez," she replied. "Flight operations coordination. Welcome aboard. Try to stay out of the aisle during service." The comment wasn't malicious, just automatic, the kind of dismissal that happens so consistently. Maya had stopped noticing the sting. The cockpit of the 737 was a familiar environment despite her observer status. Maya had studied the system's layout extensively, memorized the location of every switch, button, and circuit breaker. But as she settled into the jump seat behind the captain's position, she was reminded that knowledge and authority occupied different spaces. Captain Morrison ran through his pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. His hands moved across the overhead panel, testing lights and confirming switch positions. First Officer Chun handled the radio communications, his voice crisp and professional as he coordinated with ground control. Maya observed their routine while conducting her own silent assessment. The captain's scan pattern was thorough but rushed in places where maintenance logs indicated potential issues. The first officer's radio work was competent, but lacked the edge awareness that came from understanding how quickly normal could become abnormal. From her position, she could see the engine indication displays, the flight management computer readouts, the primary flight instruments that would tell the story of their journey. She'd spent hours studying the failure modes of each system, understanding how redundancy worked, learning the decision trees that guided emergency procedures. The passenger boarding process began, and Maya watched through the cockpit door as travelers filed into the cabin. Business travelers with laptops and coffee, families herding children toward their seats, elderly passengers moving slowly down the narrow aisle. 198 people who would spend the next 2.5 hours trusting that the two men in front of her could handle whatever flying required. During the safety demonstration, Maya reviewed the departure procedures for Denver International. The high-altitude airport presented unique challenges to density-altitude effects, mountain wave turbulence potential, rapidly changing weather patterns that could complicate climbing flight paths. She'd studied these factors not because anyone asked, but because understanding seemed more important than belonging. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Captain Morrison keyed the intercom with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've got a beautiful day for flying with clear skies most of the way to Chicago. Flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The engine spooled up with the familiar whine of high-bypass turbofans, and Maya felt the subtle acceleration as they began their taxi toward runway 34R. Through the cockpit windows, the Colorado Rockies dominated the western horizon, their peaks catching the morning light in shades of purple and gold. What Maya couldn't see from her position was the microscopic crack developing in a hydraulic line deep within the aircraft's belly, or the way the first officer's breakfast sandwich had been prepared by a food service worker who'd called in sick but couldn't afford to miss work. She couldn't see the chain of seemingly unrelated events that would soon converge to test every assumption about who was qualified to save lives at 38,000 feet. But she had prepared for scenarios like this anyway, not because she expected them, but because preparation was the only response she knew to a world that consistently underestimated what she was capable of understanding. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Captain Morrison advanced the throttles smoothly. The 737 accelerated down the runway with increasing urgency, its wheels lifting clear of the concrete as they climbed into the thin mountain air. Maya watched the engine parameters, noted the slight asymmetry in fuel flow that fell within normal limits but indicated a minor imbalance she would have corrected if anyone had asked her opinion. No one had asked. No one ever did. But as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude and the pilots settled into their routine, Maya continued her quiet observation, her mental preparation, her constant readiness for the moment when watching would no longer be enough. Flight 447 reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet as the Colorado landscape gave way to the endless expanse of Kansas farmland below. Maya pulled a worn leather notebook from her portfolio, its pages filled with hand-drawn diagrams and meticulously recorded data that nobody had ever asked to see. The notebook contained 3 years of accumulated knowledge that began long before her current position. Each page represented hours spent in libraries, technical manuals borrowed from mechanics, simulator sessions paid for with money scraped together from part-time jobs. Page 47 showed detailed hydraulic system schematics for the 737-800, complete with pressure ratings and failure point calculations. Page 62 contained emergency descent profiles for various weight configurations and altitude scenarios. Captain Morrison adjusted his seat and settled into the cruise routine, his attention shifting between instrument scans and casual conversation with First Officer Chun about weekend golf plans. The autopilot held the aircraft steady while both pilots allowed their vigilance to ease into the comfortable rhythm of routine flight operations. Maya opened to a section marked single-engine approach procedures and reviewed calculations she'd worked through dozens of times. The mathematics of emergency flight weren't complicated, but they required absolute precision under conditions where precision became nearly impossible to maintain. She'd memorized the glide ratios for partial power scenarios, the minimum speeds for various flap configurations, the decision points where choices became irreversible. 3 months earlier, she'd spent her entire savings on a weekend at a flight training facility in Arizona, practicing emergency procedures in a 737 simulator that cost $400 per hour. The instructor had been puzzled by her requests. Most simulator time went to pilots maintaining currency or working toward type ratings, not operations coordinators studying theoretical emergencies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Why do you need to know single pilot procedures for a transport category aircraft? He'd asked during the second session. Unless you're planning a career change, this is pretty specialized knowledge. Maya had deflected the question with something about better understanding flight operations, but the truth was more complex. She studied these procedures because somewhere deep in her mind lived the certainty that knowledge unused was better than ignorance discovered too late. She learned emergency flying because the alternative, being helpless when others needed help, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental about who she was. The notebook's margins contained details that revealed the depth of her preparation. Fuel consumption rates for single-engine operations. Radio frequencies for emergency services at 47 different airports. Weather minimums for precision approaches at facilities equipped with Category 3 instrument landing systems. Each piece of information had been gathered, verified, and committed to memory through repetition that bordered on obsession. Her apartment in Aurora contained a small library of aviation, technical publications that she'd accumulated through online, auctions and industry contacts, federal aviation regulations, aircraft operating manuals, emergency response procedures documents that cost hundreds of dollars, but could sometimes be found used by someone who understood their value. She'd read each manual cover to cover, taking notes in the careful handwriting that filled her notebook. The irony wasn't lost on her that she possessed more current technical knowledge about emergency procedures than many line pilots who'd grown comfortable with routine operations. Commercial aviation safety record meant that most pilots never encountered true emergencies, never needed to apply the procedures they'd memorized for initial training, and largely forgotten through years of normal flights. Maya had studied accident reports with the methodical attention of an investigator, not for morbid fascination, but to understand the decision points where training either succeeded or failed. She'd analyzed the crew resource management failures, the automation dependencies, the moments when pilots discovered that their experience had prepared them for normal operations, but not for scenarios that fell outside the boundaries of routine. 737's flight management computer displayed their current position over western Kansas, with Chicago O'Hare still an hour and 40 minutes ahead. Maya checked the weather reports she'd printed before departure conditions at their destination remained favorable, but a line of thunderstorms was developing across southern Illinois that could complicate approaches later in the day. She'd already identified 3 alternate airports within their current fuel range and memorized the approach procedures for each. This wasn't required for her observer role, but Maya had learned that preparation was like physical fitness. It required constant maintenance to remain useful when needed. During a brief stretch of turbulence, she watched both pilots respond with the automatic adjustments that came from thousands of hours of experience. Their hands moved to the controls with practiced confidence, their scan patterns covering the essential instruments without conscious thought. But Maya also noticed the subtle signs of complacency that crept into any routine operation, the tendency to rely on automation, the assumption that normal conditions would continue, the gradual erosion of manual flying skills that occurred when every flight went exactly as planned. Her notebook contained exercises she designed for herself to combat that same complacency, mental scenarios that required quick calculations, decision trees for equipment failures, communication procedures for emergency situations where standard phraseology might prove inadequate. She'd practiced these mental drills during countless observer flights, using the routine cruise segments to sharpen skills that might never be needed but couldn't be developed under pressure. The flight attendant's call chime sounded, and Jennifer Walsh's voice came through the intercom. "Captain, we're starting cabin service. No issues and the back passengers are settled and comfortable." "Copy that, Jennifer." "Thanks," Captain Morrison replied, then turned to his first officer. "Coffee?" "Absolutely. Long morning already." Maya declined when offered, not from any particular preference, but because she'd learned to maintain different standards during flight operations. She'd read too many accident reports where small decisions, accepting coffee, adjusting seats for comfort, engaging in casual conversation, had contributed to reduced vigilance at critical moments. While the pilots enjoyed their coffee and discussed company rumors about route changes and equipment assignments, Maya continued her silent study. She traced her finger along approach charts for Chicago O'Hare, noting the complexity of the airspace, the multiple runway configurations, the precision required to operate safely in one of the world's busiest terminal areas. Her preparation extended beyond technical knowledge to include the human factors that influenced emergency decision-making. She'd studied the psychology of crisis response, the ways that stress degraded cognitive performance, the importance of procedural memory when analytical thinking became overwhelmed by circumstances. The notebook's final section contained what she privately called her emergency leadership protocols, procedures she developed for taking command in situations where formal authority might be compromised. These weren't official procedures, just personal guidelines for how to communicate clearly, maintain situational awareness, and make decisions when time and information were both limited. Maya understood that her gender, her age, her position as an observer might create additional challenges in any emergency scenario. She'd thought carefully about how to establish credibility quickly, how to convey competence without appearing threatening to pilots who might feel defensive about accepting help from someone they'd dismissed as unqualified. The aircraft hit another patch of light turbulence, and Maya automatically noted the time, altitude, and weather conditions. Her mental log contained hundreds of such observations, patterns of atmospheric behavior, aircraft responses to various conditions, the subtle indicators that preceded more significant weather encounters. This data served no immediate purpose, but Maya collected it anyway, building a database of experience that existed entirely in her mind. As they crossed into Missouri airspace, she reviewed the fuel calculations one more time. The flight was proceeding normally, consumption rates matching the flight plan projections, no indication of any developing issues. But Maya's preparation had taught her that emergencies rarely announce themselves with obvious warning signs. More often, they emerged from the convergence of small problems, minor deviations that accumulated into major challenges before anyone recognized the pattern. Her watch showed they were now 90 minutes into the flight, with approximately 55 minutes remaining to their scheduled arrival. The cabin was quiet, passengers settled into the rhythm of cruise flight, flight attendants moving efficiently through their service routine. Everything proceeded exactly as planned, exactly as expected, exactly as it had on thousands of previous flights. Maya closed her notebook and returned it to her portfolio, but her mental preparation continued. She reviewed emergency frequencies, calculated current distance to suitable alternate airports, assessed weather trends that might affect approach procedures. All of this happened silently, automatically, while maintaining the appearance of a passive observer, learning the basics of commercial flight operations. What she couldn't anticipate was how quickly her preparation would transition from theoretical exercise to desperate necessity, or how the skills she developed in isolation would prove essential to the survival of everyone aboard Flight 447. But she had prepared anyway, methodically and completely, because Maya Rodriguez understood that expertise meant being ready for challenges that might never come, and that readiness was the only rational response to uncertainty. The first sign of trouble came, disguised as routine maintenance chatter. Maya overheard Captain Morrison discussing with First Officer Chun a minor hydraulic pressure fluctuation that had appeared briefly during their initial climb, a reading that dipped below normal parameters for exactly 4 seconds before returning to green. "Probably just a sensor glitch," Morrison said, tapping the hydraulic display with his finger. "These older birds sometimes get twitchy readings when the pumps cycle through their warm-up sequence." Chun nodded agreement, but Maya noticed he kept glancing at the display more frequently than normal. The fluctuation had occurred in the primary hydraulic system, the one that controlled essential flight surfaces, landing gear operation, and primary braking systems. A sensor glitch was the most likely explanation, but Maya's extensive study of 737 maintenance records had taught her that intermittent problems rarely remained intermittent for long. She made a mental note of the time and conditions when the fluctuation had occurred, cross-referencing this information with her knowledge of system interdependencies. The Boeing 737's hydraulic architecture used 2 independent systems with manual reversion capability, but manual control required significantly more physical strength and precise coordination than most pilots practiced regularly. The cabin service proceeded smoothly, passengers enjoying their beverages and snacks while flight attendants moved through their practiced routines. Maya watched Jennifer Walsh coordinate her crew with the efficiency that came from thousands of similar flights. But she also noticed subtle changes in the cockpit atmosphere that suggested the pilots' confidence wasn't as absolute as their casual conversation implied. Captain Morrison had increased the frequency of his instrument scans, his eyes lingering slightly longer on the hydraulic panel than necessary if everything was truly normal. First Officer Chun had shifted in his seat twice in the past 10 minutes, a minor behavioral change that most observers would miss, but that Maya recognized as a sign of subconscious tension. The weather ahead was developing exactly as the morning forecasts had predicted, with a line of thunderstorms building across southern Illinois and Indiana. What the forecasts hadn't captured was the unusual intensity of the system's development. Storms that had been predicted as moderate were showing strong returns on weather radar, with precipitation cores and turbulence extending to altitudes that could affect commercial traffic. Chicago Approach Control began issuing routing changes to aircraft approaching from the west, directing flights around the developing weather systems. Maya listened to the radio communications and noted the increasing complexity of traffic management as controllers worked to maintain safe separation while accommodating weather deviations. Flight 447, Chicago Approach. Be advised, we're showing moderate to heavy precipitation along your current route. Are you able to accept vectors for weather deviation? Captain Morrison keyed the microphone. Chicago Approach, Flight 447. We can accept reasonable deviations, but we'd prefer to stay north of the primary cell if possible. Flight 447, Roger. Fly heading 270, descend and maintain flight level 30. Traffic is Midwest Regional at 2 o'clock 5 miles, descending to flight level 280. The heading change added approximately 15 minutes to their flight time and required a fuel calculation adjustment that Maya performed automatically in her head. Their reserve margins remained comfortable, but the buffer for unexpected developments had decreased. More concerning was the gradual erosion of options that came with weather deviations, fewer alternate airports, longer routes to suitable landing facilities, increased workload for air traffic controllers already managing complex traffic flows. Maya observed the pilots' adaptation to changing conditions with the critical eye of someone who understood both the capabilities and limitations of human performance under stress. Both men were handling the weather deviation professionally, but she noticed the subtle signs of increasing workload, shorter responses to routine communications, less casual conversation, more frequent cross-checks of navigation displays. Hydraulic pressure fluctuation occurred again, this time lasting 7 seconds and dropping to a lower minimum value before recovering. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he reached for the aircraft systems manual tucked into the side pocket of his seat. "Dave, take a look at this hydraulic reading," he said, his voice maintaining professional calm while conveying underlying concern. "It's probably nothing, but I want to review the troubleshooting checklist." First Officer Chun leaned over to examine the display more closely. Pressure's back to normal now. Could be pump cavitation from the altitude change, or maybe a pressure sensor that's starting to drift. Maya knew that pump cavitation was unlikely at their current altitude and operating conditions, and pressure sensor drift typically produced gradual changes rather than intermittent fluctuations. The pattern they were seeing suggested a more serious underlying problem, possibly a developing leak in the hydraulic system that would become progressively worse as flight conditions changed. The troubleshooting checklist for intermittent hydraulic pressure loss contains 17 different procedures, ranging from simple pump cycling to preparation for manual reversion flight controls. Maya had memorized every step of those procedures during her simulator training in Arizona, understanding that hydraulic system failures represented one of the most challenging emergency scenarios for commercial aircraft operations. As Flight 447 descended through 28,000 feet, the ride became noticeably rougher. Turbulence associated with the weather system created moderate bumps that had passengers gripping their armrests in flight, attendants moving more carefully through the cabin. Maya felt the aircraft's responses to the turbulence and noted subtle differences from normal handling characteristics, slight delays in roll response, minor variations in pitch control authority that suggested the hydraulic system was operating at reduced efficiency. Captain Morrison completed his review of the troubleshooting procedures and made a decision that revealed his growing concern about their situation. "Dave, let's go ahead and run through the hydraulic system backup procedures, just as a precaution." "You want to declare an emergency?" Chun asked. "Not yet, but I want to make sure we're prepared if this develops into something more serious." The backup procedures required both pilots to verify the operation of manual flight controls, confirm the availability of emergency hydraulic systems, and review the approaches available at their destination airport. Maya listened to their methodical preparation while conducting her own mental review of single-engine approach procedures, manual landing techniques, and emergency communication protocols. What troubled her most was the intersection of multiple developing problems. Weather deviations had reduced their fuel margins and limited their alternate airport options. Hydraulic system anomalies were creating uncertainty about aircraft controllability. Air traffic control workload was increasing due to weather-related complexity, which meant less individual attention available for aircraft experiencing difficulties. The combination of these factors created what aviation safety experts called a normalization of deviance, a gradual acceptance of degraded conditions. That could lead to inadequate responses when the situation deteriorated further. Maya had studied dozens of accidents that began with minor problems that crews initially dismissed as manageable, only to discover too late that their small problems had become large ones. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh approached the cockpit, her professional demeanor masking what Maya recognized as controlled concern. "Captain, we're getting some passenger questions about the turbulence. Any update on how long we'll be in rough air?" "Should be smoother once we get established on the approach," Morrison replied. "Probably another 20 minutes of bumps." Walsh nodded and returned to the cabin, but Maya noticed she'd glanced at the hydraulic display during her brief time in the cockpit. Experienced flight attendants developed an instinct for recognizing when routine flights were becoming something more complicated, and Walsh's expression suggested she was picking up subtle signals that all was not entirely well. The hydraulic pressure dropped again, this time accompanied by a brief master caution light that illuminated before quickly extinguishing. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chun exchanged glances that conveyed shared recognition. Their situation was definitely developing beyond normal parameters. "Okay, let's get serious about this," Morrison said. "I want you to pull up Chicago O'Hare approach plates and review our options for emergency landing procedures. I'm going to contact maintenance control and see if they have any additional guidance for this hydraulic issue." As the pilots began their expanded emergency preparations, Maya silently reviewed every piece of knowledge she'd accumulated about hydraulic system failures, emergency approach procedures, and crew resource management during crisis situations. She understood that her role as an observer typically meant remaining quiet and staying out of the way, but she also understood that circumstances could change rapidly in aviation, and that preparation meant being ready for any role that circumstances might require. The turbulence intensified as they continued their descent toward Chicago, and Maya felt the aircraft struggling slightly with control responses that should have been immediate and precise. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the dark line of thunderstorms stretching across their intended route, with lightning flickering through the clouds like artillery fire in a distant battle. Time was running short. Weather was complicating. Their approach options, and their aircraft was developing mechanical problems that could escalate without warning. Maya recognized the classic setup for an aviation emergency: multiple small problems converging into a situation that would test every assumption about normal operations and standard procedures. She remained silent in her observer seat, but her mind was fully engaged with calculations, procedures, and preparations that no one had asked her to perform. Because Maya Rodriguez understood that expertise meant being ready for scenarios that weren't supposed to happen, and that the most dangerous phrase in aviation was, "That will never happen to us." The contaminated breakfast sandwiches had been prepared 14 hours earlier at a catering facility in Denver, where an employee working with a mild case of food poisoning had followed company policy requiring attendance despite illness. The salmonella bacteria had multiplied slowly during refrigerated storage, reaching dangerous concentrations precisely as Flight 447's crew consumed their pre-landing meal. Captain Morrison was the first to feel the onset of symptoms, a sudden wave of nausea that he initially attributed to turbulence. The cramping in his abdomen intensified rapidly, accompanied by cold sweats and the unmistakable recognition that something was seriously wrong with his digestive system. "Dave, I need you to take the controls," Morrison said, his voice strained, as he unbuckled his harness. "I'm feeling pretty sick all of a sudden." First Officer Chun acknowledged the transfer of control authority, while Morrison made an urgent departure for the lavatory, leaving the cockpit at precisely the moment when their hydraulic system chose to fail completely. The master caution alarm filled the cockpit with urgent electronic warnings as multiple systems simultaneously indicated failures, cascading through the aircraft's primary control mechanisms. Chun's hands flew across the control panel, silencing alarms and attempting to assess the scope of their emergency. The hydraulic pressure readings showed complete loss of both primary and secondary systems, while backup manual controls activated automatically. The flight control surfaces became dramatically heavier, requiring significant physical strength to maintain basic aircraft control. Maya watched the crisis unfold with the hyper-awareness that came from extensive preparation, meeting actual emergency conditions. She could see Chun struggling with the increased control forces, his movements becoming less precise as fatigue began affecting his ability to maintain proper flight attitude. The aircraft was beginning a shallow descent due to trim settings that were no longer appropriate for manual control configuration. "Maya," Chun called over his shoulder, sweat visible on his forehead. "I need you to get on the radio and declare an emergency. Tell Chicago Approach we've lost hydraulic systems and need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." Before Maya could respond, Chun's condition deteriorated rapidly. The same food poisoning that had incapacitated Captain Morrison struck with sudden severity, leaving the first officer doubled over with severe abdominal cramping and nausea that made concentration impossible. "I can't," Chun gasped, his hands leaving the controls as he fought waves of sickness. "The controls are yours." "I have to." He unbuckled frantically and stumbled toward the lavatory, leaving Maya alone in the cockpit with a Boeing 737 carrying 200 passengers, no functioning hydraulic systems, and a rapidly deteriorating flight situation that would have challenged even the most experienced crew under normal circumstances. For a split second, Maya sat frozen in her observer seat, confronting the reality that everything she had studied and prepared for was no longer theoretical. The aircraft was descending through 18,000 feet with no one at the controls. The autopilot had disconnected when the hydraulic systems failed, and she was the only person aboard with the knowledge and capability to prevent a catastrophe. She moved to the captain's seat with swift efficiency, her simulator training translating directly into real-world application. Her hands found the controls and immediately felt the massive increase in control forces that came with manual reversion. "Flight." The 737 responded to her inputs, But every movement required deliberate strength and precise timing that would exhaust even experienced pilots over extended periods. The master warning panel showed a cascade of system failures. Hydraulic pressure 0. Flight control backup mode engaged. Landing gear systems inoperative through normal controls. Wheel brakes available only through alternate systems. Maya's mental preparation had covered every one of these failures, but experiencing them simultaneously in actual flight created a complexity that exceeded any training scenario she had practiced. Chicago approach. This is American 447 declaring an emergency. Maya transmitted, her voice steady despite the unprecedented situation. We have complete hydraulic system failure and are currently under single pilot operations due to crew incapacitation. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by. The radio response came immediately, controllers' training kicking in despite the unusual nature of the emergency. American 447, Chicago approach copies. Your emergency declaration. Confirm you said single pilot operations. Affirmative, Chicago. Flight crew is incapacitated due to food poisoning. I am a qualified pilot taking emergency control of the aircraft. We need vectors for manual approach and full emergency response. Maya could hear the brief pause as the controller processed information that fell outside normal emergency procedures. Single pilot operations of transport category aircraft were virtually unprecedented in commercial aviation, particularly with complete hydraulic system failure creating maximum difficulty. Flying conditions. American 447, turn left heading 240, descend and maintain 10,000 feet. We're vectoring you toward Chicago Midway Airport, shorter runways, but less traffic. Can you confirm your qualification level? As Maya struggled with the heavy controls to execute the turn, she transmitted her credentials while simultaneously managing the aircraft's configuration for emergency approach procedures. Chicago, I hold a commercial pilot certificate with multi-engine and instrument ratings. 800 hours total time, current on 737 systems through simulator training. The controller's response reflected the desperate nature of their situation. American 447, understood. We're declaring an emergency for the airspace and clearing all traffic. Runway 22 left at Midway is 13,000 feet long. Emergency equipment is rolling now. In the cabin behind Maya, flight attendant Jennifer Walsh was dealing with her own crisis as passengers began to notice the aircraft's unusual flight characteristics and the absence of normal crew communications. The manual control inputs created more pronounced movements than typical autopilot flight, while the extended period without updates from the cockpit generated increasing anxiety. Among the 198 souls aboard, Walsh made the decision to enter the cockpit for information, opening the door to discover a situation that her 20 years of flight attendant experience had never prepared her to handle. Maya Rodriguez, the quiet observer who had been dismissed by the crew that morning, was alone at the controls of their aircraft while both pilots remained incapacitated in the lavatory. What's happening? Walsh asked, her professional composure masking profound shock at the reversal of authority and capability. Complete hydraulic failure combined with crew food poisoning, Maya replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. I'm flying a manual approach to Midway. I need you to prepare the cabin for emergency landing brace positions, emergency equipment checks, passenger briefing for possible evacuation. Walsh nodded and turned to implement emergency procedures, but she paused at the cockpit door. Maya, can you actually land this thing? Maya adjusted the trim controls to reduce the physical strain of maintaining level flight, her response reflecting both confidence and realistic assessment of their challenges. I've practiced this exact scenario multiple times in simulation. The aircraft is controllable, but it's going to be a very demanding approach. We need everyone back prepared for a hard landing. As Walsh returned to the cabin to coordinate emergency preparations, Maya focused on the complex task of manually flying a transport category aircraft through an approach that would require precise energy management, perfect timing, and physical endurance that would test the limits of her preparation. The weather around Chicago remained challenging, with crosswinds and turbulence that would complicate even a normal approach. With manual controls, every gust and thermal would require immediate correction, while the absence of normal hydraulic assistance meant that control inputs would become increasingly difficult as fatigue accumulated in her arms and shoulders. Maya reviewed the emergency checklist for hydraulic failure while maintaining aircraft control, her preparation allowing her to recall procedures from memory while executing the complex multitasking that emergency flying required. She configured the aircraft for manual gear extension, knowing that the landing gear would deploy but wouldn't retract if the approach had to be aborted. American 447, Chicago approach. You're 15 miles from runway 2 to left at midway. Current winds are 240 at 15 knots, gusting to 22. Visibility 10 miles. Altimeter 2992. The wind conditions added another layer of complexity to an approach that was already at the edge of her capabilities. A 15-knot crosswind with gusts would require constant rudder corrections and precise control inputs to maintain runway alignment, while the manual control forces would make small adjustments increasingly difficult as the approach progressed. Maya began her descent toward Midway Airport, the Chicago skyline visible through broken clouds ahead. Behind her, both pilots remained incapacitated, while 200 passengers trusted their lives to her preparation. Her knowledge and her ability to execute procedures she had practiced countless times, but never performed under actual emergency conditions. Most challenging part of their crisis was just beginning. And Maya Rodriguez, the observer who wasn't supposed to touch the controls, was now the only person standing between Flight 447 and the catastrophe. Maya's hands gripped the control yoke with the measured pressure that came from understanding exactly how much force the manual flight controls would demand over the next 23 minutes. The Boeing 737 responded to her inputs like a massive glider, each movement requiring deliberate strength while she maintained the precise flight path that would bring them safely to Chicago Midway Airport. The emergency checklist for complete hydraulic system failure contained 47 individual steps, many of which required coordination between pilot and co-pilot. Maya adapted the procedures for single pilot operation, using her left hand for throttle control while her right managed the heavy flight controls. Her feet worked the rudder pedals with constant micro-adjustments to maintain coordinated flight as crosswinds pushed against the aircraft's vertical stabilizer. American 447, Chicago approach. Turn right heading 180, descend and maintain 6,000 feet. You're being vectored for a straight-in approach to runway 2 to left. Maya acknowledged the clearance while executing the turn, feeling the increased control forces as she banked the aircraft through 30 degrees of heading change. The manual controls required her to lead every input, anticipating the aircraft's response rather than reacting to it. Her simulator training had prepared her for this physical demand, but sustaining it for an extended approach would test the limits of her endurance. In the cabin, Jennifer Walsh moved through the passenger compartment with practiced efficiency, her 20 years of experience allowing her to project calm authority while implementing emergency procedures. She briefed passengers on brace positions, verified that emergency equipment was accessible, and coordinated with her crew to ensure everyone understood their roles in a potential evacuation scenario. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a mechanical issue that requires us to make an emergency landing at Chicago Midway Airport, Walsh announced over the public address system. Emergency services will be standing by as a precaution. Please review the safety information card in your seat pocket and listen carefully to crew member instructions. The announcement generated the predictable wave of passenger anxiety, but Walsh noticed that the aircraft's handling had become noticeably smoother since Maya had taken control. The earlier erratic movements caused by the incapacitated crew had been replaced by steady, deliberate flight control inputs that suggested competent management of their emergency situation. Maya configured the aircraft for approach manually, extending the landing gear through the emergency backup system. The gear deployment created additional drag and changed the aircraft's handling characteristics, requiring her to add power and adjust trim to maintain the proper approach speed. She could feel the physical strain beginning to accumulate in her shoulders and forearms as the control forces increased with the gear extension. The emergency gear extension checklist required verification that all 3 landing gear were properly extended and locked. Without a functioning hydraulic system, the gear position indicators operated through backup systems that provided visual confirmation but no automated verification. Maya had to rely on physical inspection through the cockpit windows and passenger reports from cabin crew to confirm proper gear deployment. Chicago approach, American 447 requesting gear verification. From tower, Maya transmitted while maintaining precise control of her approach path. American 447, Chicago Tower. We have visual contact. Your gear appears down and locked. All 3 struts are visible and properly aligned. The confirmation allowed Maya to focus on the complex energy management required for manual approach to landing. Without normal hydraulic assistance, the aircraft required more precise speed control and earlier configuration changes to maintain a stable approach profile. She began extending flaps in increments, each setting requiring throttle adjustments to maintain the correct approach angle. Captain Morrison attempted to return to the cockpit, still pale and weakened from food poisoning, but determined to assist with the emergency landing. Maya briefed him quickly on their situation while maintaining control of the aircraft, her voice steady despite the physical demands of manual flying. Complete hydraulic failure, manual reversion throughout, she reported. Gear is down and locked. Emergency services standing by at Midway. I need you to monitor instruments and call out approach speeds while I fly the approach. Morrison nodded weakly and slumped into the right seat, his condition clearly preventing him from taking physical control but allowing him to provide limited assistance with monitoring and communication duties. His presence in the cockpit provided backup for critical tasks. Though Maya remained the primary pilot for their emergency approach, the approach to runway 22 left at Chicago Midway required precise navigation through increasingly complex airspace as emergency services responded to their situation. Maya could see the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances positioning themselves along the runway, their presence serving as both reassurance and reminder of the serious nature of their emergency. American 447, Chicago Tower. Winds are 230 at 18 knots, gusting to 25. Runway 22 left is 13,000 feet long. Emergency equipment is in position. You're cleared to land. The crosswind component was approaching the maximum demonstrated capability for manual approach in a Boeing 737, requiring Maya to maintain a crab angle during approach and execute a complex transition to wind-low technique just before touchdown. Her simulator training had included this exact scenario, but performing it with actual passengers aboard added psychological pressure that no training could fully replicate. Maya established the aircraft on final approach, her scan pattern moving between airspeed indicator, altitude, runway alignment, and engine parameters in the methodical rhythm she had practiced countless times. The physical demands of manual control meant that every input had to be precise, with no opportunity for small corrections or gradual adjustments. The runway appeared ahead, its lights creating a precise geometric pattern that Maya used for visual confirmation of proper approach angle. She maintained 95 knots of airspeed, the emergency approach speed for their configuration. While fighting crosswinds that required constant rudder inputs to maintain runway alignment at 500 feet above ground level, Maya called for landing checklist completion. Though many items were already accomplished or inapplicable due to their emergency configuration, Captain Morrison responded weakly but accurately, confirming gear position, flap setting, and approach speeds while Maya concentrated entirely on aircraft control. 200 feet, Morrison called out, his voice strained but audible. Airspeed. Steady at 95 knots. Sync rate is 800 feet per minute. Maya began the critical transition from Crabbit approach to wing-low landing technique, using aileron inputs to lower the left wing into the crosswind while applying opposite rudder to maintain runway centerline tracking. The manual controls required significantly more physical input than normal, testing her ability to maintain precise control coordination during the most demanding phase of flight. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at exactly the correct altitude and airspeed, Maya's preparation paying off in precise execution despite the unprecedented circumstances. She held the approach attitude while gradually reducing power, allowing the aircraft to settle toward the runway while maintaining crosswind corrections that would prevent lateral drift during touchdown. 50 feet, Morrison announced. 40. 30, 20. Maya pulled the throttles to idle and began the landing flare, raising the aircraft's nose slightly to reduce descent rate while preparing for touchdown. The crosswind required her to maintain wing-low attitude throughout the flare, using rudder inputs to keep the aircraft aligned with runway centerline. As the main landing gear approached contact with the pavement, the touchdown was firm, but controlled. The left main gear contacting first is designed for crosswind landings, followed immediately by the right main gear. Maya maintained back pressure on the control yoke to keep the nose wheel elevated while applying manual brakes through the emergency backup system. Without normal hydraulic pressure, the wheel brakes operated through backup systems that provided stopping capability but required more runway distance than normal operations. Maya maintained directional control with rudder inputs while gradually increasing brake pressure, feeling the aircraft decelerate as emergency vehicles tracked alongside the runway. The nose wheel touched down gently as Maya allowed the aircraft to settle into normal ground attitude, her manual brake application bringing Flight 447 to a complete stop approximately 2/3 down the 13,000-foot runway. She set the parking brake and began the shutdown checklist, her hands trembling slightly from the physical exertion of manual flying combined with adrenaline release. American 447, Chicago Tower. Excellent job. Emergency services are approaching for routine inspection. Taxi when ready to Gate S7 ground control frequency 121.9. Maya acknowledged the transmission while Captain Morrison slumped in relief, his admiration for her performance evident despite his continued illness. In the cabin, passengers erupted in spontaneous applause as they recognized their emergency. Landing had been executed with remarkable skill under extraordinary circumstances. Jennifer Walsh entered the cockpit to find Maya conducting post-landing procedures with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the emergency. The quiet observer who had been dismissed that morning had saved 200 lives through preparation, competence, and the ability to perform under pressure when everything depended on her skills. Maya, Walsh said quietly, I don't know how you did that, but thank you. Maya looked up from the checklist, her expression reflecting exhaustion and relief in equal measure. I just did what I trained for, she replied. Sometimes preparation meets opportunity, and you have to be ready. As emergency personnel conducted their inspection and passengers began deplaning, Maya completed the required paperwork documenting the emergency, her actions, and the circumstances that had led to her assuming command of Flight 447. The official record would show that an operations observer had successfully executed an emergency landing that aviation experts would later describe as extraordinary under any circumstances. But Maya Rodriguez knew that extraordinary was simply what happened when years of quiet preparation encountered a moment that demanded everything she had learned. The fire chief was the first official to board Flight 447 after emergency services completed their initial inspection of the aircraft. Chief Michael Patterson had responded to hundreds of aircraft incidents during his 28 years at Chicago Midway Airport, but he had never encountered an emergency landing executed by someone who wasn't technically qualified to be flying the aircraft in the first place. "Ma'am, I'm Chief Patterson with Midway Fire Department," he said, approaching Maya as she completed post-flight documentation in the captain's seat. "We need to conduct a brief interview regarding the emergency procedures you followed." Maya looked up from the logbook where she was recording the details of their hydraulic system failure and emergency landing. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration, her hands still trembling slightly from the physical demands of manual flight control, but her voice remained steady as she responded to his questions. "The crew became incapacitated due to food poisoning approximately 10 minutes before complete hydraulic system failure," she explained, her account methodical and precise. "I took control of the aircraft under emergency authority provisions and executed manual approach procedures according to Boeing 737 emergency checklists." Chief Patterson consulted his tablet, reviewing the preliminary incident report that had been filed by Air Traffic Control. "The tower supervisor indicates you identified yourself as a qualified pilot with commercial certification. Can you provide documentation of your credentials?" Maya reached into her portfolio and produced her pilot certificate, medical certificate, and current flight review documentation. Chief Patterson examined each document carefully, noting that her qualifications were current and appropriate for the aircraft type, though her total flight time was significantly lower than typical airline pilots. 800 hours total time. He observed, "Most commercial pilots have several thousand hours before they're cleared for transport category operations. How did you develop proficiency on 737 systems?" "Extensive simulator training at my own expense," Maya replied. "I've completed over 40 hours of emergency procedures training in 737 simulators, including multiple scenarios involving hydraulic system failures and single pilot operations." Chief Patterson made detailed notes while Maya provided a complete chronology of events, her preparation, and the decision-making process that had led to her assumption of command. Her account demonstrated thorough understanding of emergency procedures, appropriate risk assessment, and execution that had clearly exceeded normal expectations for her experience level. Captain Morrison, still pale but recovering from his food poisoning, approached the interview area with support from paramedics who had been monitoring his condition. His assessment of Maya's performance carried significant weight, given his 15,000 hours of commercial flying experience and his first-hand observation of her emergency management. "Chief Patterson, I need to be clear about something," Morrison said, his voice weak but emphatic. "What Maya accomplished today was exceptional under any circumstances. She didn't just land the airplane, she executed procedures that would challenge pilots with 10 times her experience." The captain's endorsement reflected both professional judgment and personal gratitude, but it also raised questions about how the aviation industry evaluated pilot qualifications and recognized competence that existed outside traditional career progression paths. Maya's performance had demonstrated skills that couldn't be measured by flight hours alone. Dr. Sarah Chun, a flight surgeon from the Federal Aviation Administration, arrived to conduct medical examinations of the crew and investigate the food poisoning incident that had triggered the emergency. Her preliminary assessment confirmed severe bacterial infection in both pilots, with symptoms that would have made continued flight duties impossible. "The onset was rapid and severe," Dr. Chun explained to Chief Patterson. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chun both show signs of salmonella poisoning consistent with contaminated food consumption. They would have been completely incapacitated within minutes of symptom onset. The medical findings established the legitimacy of Maya's emergency assumption of command while raising serious questions about food safety protocols for commercial flight crews. The investigation would later reveal systemic problems at the Denver catering facility that had supplied contaminated meals to multiple flights that day. Jennifer Walsh provided her perspective on Maya's performance from the flight attendant viewpoint, describing the calm professionalism that had characterized her communication with cabin crew throughout the emergency. Walsh's 20 years of experience with various pilots gave her observations particular credibility. "She kept us informed without creating panic," Walsh reported. Her instructions were clear and specific, and she maintained aircraft control throughout the approach in a way that felt completely professional. The passengers had confidence in her capabilities from the moment she took command. The passenger perspective was documented through interviews conducted by airport officials, with unanimous praise for Maya's handling of the emergency. Several passengers were experienced travelers who recognized the complexity of what they had witnessed, while others simply appreciated the calm confidence that had characterized the entire emergency response. Thomas Bradley, a passenger in seat 12A, was himself a retired Air Force pilot with transport aircraft experience. His assessment carried particular weight due to his understanding of the technical challenges involved in manual approach procedures. "I've flown transport aircraft for 30 years, and I can honestly say that was one of the most skillfully executed emergency approaches I've ever witnessed," Bradley stated. The crosswind conditions alone would have been challenging for an experienced crew with normal hydraulic systems. What she accomplished with manual controls was remarkable. As news of the emergency spread through aviation industry channels, Maya found herself at the center of discussions about pilot qualification standards, emergency preparedness training, and the recognition of competence that existed outside traditional career paths. Her successful resolution of Flight 447's emergency challenged assumptions about how aviation expertise was developed and validated. The first media interview came from aviation industry publication Flying Magazine, whose editor had learned about the emergency through air traffic control communications. Maya agreed to speak with reporter Amanda Harris, understanding that her story might influence discussions about pilot training and qualification standards. "I never intended to become a pilot that day," Maya explained during the interview. "I was there as an observer, learning about commercial operations. But I had prepared extensively for emergency scenarios because I believe that knowledge is only valuable if you're ready to apply it when circumstances require action." The interview revealed the extent of Maya's self-directed preparation, the financial sacrifices she had made for simulator training, and her methodical approach to learning emergency procedures that most pilots never expected to use. Her story resonated with aviation professionals who recognized the value of preparation over presumption. Captain Rebecca Martinez, chief pilot for the airline, arrived at Midway Airport to conduct the official company investigation of the incident. Martinez brought 25 years of commercial flying experience and responsibility for evaluating pilot performance across the airline's entire operation. "Maya, I need to understand exactly how you developed the skills you demonstrated today," Martinez said during their formal interview. "Your performance exceeded what we would expect from pilots with significantly more experience." Maya described her systematic approach to learning emergency procedures, her study of accident reports and case studies, and her decision to invest in simulator training that went far beyond what her position required. Her methodology reflected an understanding that expertise required deliberate practice rather than passive accumulation of experience. "I studied every scenario I could imagine because I wanted to be prepared for situations that might never occur," Maya explained. Today proved that preparation was worthwhile, even though I never expected to use it under these circumstances. Captain Martinez reviewed Maya's training records, simulator performance evaluations, and the detailed notes she had maintained throughout her observer flights. The documentation revealed a level of preparation and professional development that exceeded many line pilots' ongoing training requirements. The technical investigation of Flight 447's hydraulic system failure revealed a rare manufacturing defect that had caused simultaneous failure of both primary and backup systems. The failure mode was so unusual that it wasn't covered in standard training curricula, making Maya's successful handling of the emergency even more remarkable. Boeing engineering representatives who examined the aircraft confirmed that the hydraulic failure represented one of the most challenging emergency scenarios possible in 737 operations. The combination of complete system loss with crosswind landing conditions created difficulty levels that pushed the boundaries of what manual flight controls could accommodate. The successful outcome required exceptional skill, preparation, and execution, stated Boeing's chief test pilot James Wilson. This type of emergency has been simulated in our test programs, but actual successful resolution under operational conditions is extremely rare. The National Transportation Safety Board initiated a formal investigation of the incident, focusing both on the hydraulic system failure and the food safety issues that had incapacitated the crew. Maya's role would be examined as part of understanding how emergency situations could be successfully resolved through preparedness and competence. NTSB investigator Lisa Thompson interviewed Maya extensively about her decision-making process, her training background, and the specific procedures she had followed during the emergency. Thompson's experience with aviation accidents gave her particular insight into the factors that contributed to successful emergency outcomes. Your performance represents exactly the kind of preparation and competence that prevents accidents, Thompson told Maya. You had the knowledge, the skills, and the judgment to handle a situation that could easily have become a catastrophe. The investigation would later cite Maya's emergency management as a case study in effective crisis response, highlighting the importance of thorough preparation and the ability to adapt standard procedures to unprecedented circumstances. Within hours of the emergency landing, Maya's story had spread throughout aviation social media and professional networks. Pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and aviation enthusiasts shared accounts of her performance, with admiration for both her technical competence and her quiet professionalism under extreme pressure. The response from the aviation community was overwhelmingly positive, with experienced professionals recognizing the exceptional nature of what Maya had accomplished. Her story became a focal point for discussions about pilot training, qualification standards, and the value of preparation that extended beyond minimum requirements. Captain David Sullivan, a Czech airman with 30 years of experience, posted a detailed analysis of Maya's performance on the Professional Pilots Forum, describing her emergency management as textbook execution under the most challenging possible circumstances. This young woman demonstrated skills that would challenge the most experienced crews, Sullivan wrote. Her success wasn't luck, it was the result of preparation, study, and determination that should serve as an example for every pilot in our industry. As the immediate aftermath of the emergency settled into formal investigation and documentation processes, Maya found herself facing questions about her future in aviation. Her demonstration of exceptional competence under pressure had created opportunities that hadn't existed before Flight 447's emergency. Captain Martinez approached Maya with a proposition that reflected both the airline's recognition of her capabilities and the practical reality that exceptional performance deserved exceptional recognition. Maya, I want to offer you a position in our pilot development program, Martinez said. Your performance today demonstrated that you possess the skills, judgment, and temperament we need in our cockpits. We can provide the additional training and experience you need to qualify for first officer positions. The offer represented validation of everything Maya had worked toward, recognition that her preparation and competence had value beyond her current position as an operations observer. But it also represented a fundamental change in how the aviation industry might evaluate and develop pilot talent. Maya's response reflected both gratitude for the opportunity and awareness of the broader implications of her emergency performance. "I appreciate the offer, Captain Martinez," she said. "I've always wanted to be a commercial pilot, and I'm honored that you would consider me for your development program. But I also want to understand how we can better identify and develop talent that might exist in unexpected places." Her question highlighted one of the most significant lessons from Flight 447's emergency, that competence and expertise could develop through dedication and preparation, even when traditional career paths weren't available. Maya's story suggested that the aviation industry might benefit from recognizing and nurturing talent wherever it was found. The Federal Aviation Administration announced that Maya's emergency performance would be studied as part of a broader review of pilot qualification standards and emergency preparedness training. Her successful resolution of an unprecedented emergency had demonstrated both the value of thorough preparation and the need for training programs that emphasized competence over credentials. As Maya completed the final documentation required for the incident investigation, she reflected on the day that had transformed her from an overlooked observer into a recognized pilot. Her preparation had met opportunity in the most dramatic possible way, but the true validation came from knowing that her dedication to learning had served its ultimate purpose, saving lives when it mattered most. The quiet competence that had been dismissed that morning was now recognized as exactly what aviation needed: professionals who prepared not for recognition or advancement, but for the moment when everything would depend on their ability to perform under impossible circumstances. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing at Chicago Midway, Maya Rodriguez stood at the podium of the International Society of Air Safety Investigators Annual Conference, looking out at an audience of the world's most experienced aviation professionals. The conference badge hanging from her lanyard no longer read Observer or Operations Coordinator. It simply said Captain Maya Rodriguez, commercial pilot. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The months following the emergency had been filled with intensive training, evaluation flights, and the kind of scrutiny that came with having demonstrated exceptional competence under circumstances that challenged every assumption about how aviation expertise was recognized and developed. Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference moderator and former NASA test pilot, introduced Maya with words that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Today's keynote speaker saved 200 lives through preparation that no one required, competence that no one recognized, and performance that no one thought possible from someone in her position. Maya's speech had been carefully prepared, not because she lacked confidence in her abilities, but because she understood that her words would influence discussions about pilot training, qualification standards, and the recognition of expertise that existed outside traditional career paths. The aviation industry was listening, and what she said could shape policy for decades. The morning of Flight 447, I was told to sit quietly and observe, Maya began, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had characterized her emergency radio communications. I was there to learn the basics, to watch real pilots do real work, to maybe understand a fraction of what aviation actually required. The audience listened with the kind of attention that came from understanding they were hearing from someone who had performed under pressure in ways most of them never would. Maya's story had already become legend in aviation circles, but hearing it directly from her added dimensions that technical reports couldn't capture. What they didn't know was that I had spent 3 years preparing for scenarios I never expected to encounter, Maya continued. I studied emergency procedures not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed that knowledge was only valuable if you were ready to apply it when circumstances demanded action. Her speech detailed the systematic preparation that had made her emergency performance possible, the hundreds of hours spent studying technical manuals, the financial sacrifices for simulator training, the methodical approach to learning that had transformed theoretical knowledge into practical competence. I calculated fuel consumption rates for single-engine operations not because it was part of my job description, but because understanding those calculations might someday save lives. I memorized approach procedures for airports I had never visited, because preparation meant being ready for destinations you never planned to reach. The audience included pilots, engineers, regulators, and safety investigators who recognized the exceptional nature of what Maya described. Her preparation had gone far beyond what most professionals considered necessary, demonstrating a level of dedication that challenged conventional assumptions about how expertise was developed. Captain Thomas Anderson, a Czech airman with 40 years of experience, later described Maya's presentation as the most compelling argument I've ever heard for the value of preparation over presumption. His assessment reflected the growing recognition that Maya's story represented more than an individual success. It suggested fundamental changes in how the aviation industry might identify and develop talent. The Federal Aviation Administration had already begun implementing policy changes based on lessons learned from Flight 447's emergency. Administrator Sarah Mitchell announced new requirements for emergency preparedness training that emphasized competence over credentials, practical skills over theoretical knowledge. Maya Rodriguez's performance demonstrated that expertise can develop through dedication and preparation, even when traditional career paths aren't available, Mitchell stated during a press conference announcing the policy changes. We need training programs that recognize and nurture that kind of commitment, wherever we find it. The new policies included provisions for accelerated qualification programs for individuals who demonstrated exceptional competence through non-traditional preparation methods. Maya's path from observer to captain would serve as a model for recognizing talent that might otherwise remain overlooked by conventional recruitment and training systems. Boeing Corporation announced that Maya's emergency procedures would be incorporated into their standard training curricula for 737 operations. Her execution of manual approach procedures under adverse conditions had provided insights that enhanced understanding of aircraft capabilities and pilot performance under extreme stress. The successful outcome of Flight 447 required exceptional skill, but it also demonstrated the effectiveness of thorough preparation and systematic training, stated Boeing's Chief Training Officer Michael Chun. Maya's methods offer valuable lessons for how we can better prepare all pilots for emergency scenarios. The aircraft manufacturer's decision to incorporate Maya's procedures into their training programs represented unprecedented recognition of expertise developed outside traditional channels. Her influence on commercial aviation training would extend far beyond her individual performance, affecting how thousands of future pilots would prepare for emergency scenarios. The National Transportation Safety Board's final report on Flight 447 cited Maya's emergency management as a case study in effective crisis response, highlighting specific elements of her performance that contributed to the successful outcome. The report became required reading for aviation safety courses at universities and training institutions worldwide. NTS B investigator Lisa Thompson, who had conducted extensive interviews with Maya during the investigation, emphasized the broader implications of her performance for aviation safety. This incident demonstrated that exceptional outcomes are possible when thorough preparation meets competent execution under pressure. The report detailed 17 specific aspects of Maya's emergency management that exceeded standard expectations for pilot performance. From her initial assessment of the hydraulic system failure to her execution of manual approach procedures in challenging weather conditions, each element reflected preparation that had gone far beyond minimum requirements. Maya's story had attracted international attention from aviation professionals who recognized both the exceptional nature of her performance and its implications for pilot training worldwide. The International Civil Aviation Organization invited her to speak at their Global Safety Summit, where she addressed regulatory officials from 191 member countries. The lesson from Flight 447 isn't that exceptional performance requires exceptional circumstances, Maya told the international audience. The lesson is that exceptional performance requires exceptional preparation, and that preparation can happen anywhere, anytime, if we're committed to excellence rather than adequacy. Her presentation influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of international aviation regulation, with several countries announcing new programs designed to identify and develop pilot talent through enhanced training opportunities and competence-based qualification standards. The European Aviation Safety Agency announced plans for a pilot program that would evaluate candidates based on demonstrated competence rather than traditional flight hour requirements. Maya's path from observer to captain had proven that skills and judgment could be developed through dedicated preparation, even when conventional career progression wasn't available. Aviation training institutions worldwide began examining their curricula in light of Maya's example, questioning whether their programs adequately prepared pilots for scenarios that fell outside normal operations. Her systematic approach to emergency preparedness became a model for enhanced training programs that emphasized practical competence over theoretical knowledge. Dr. James Harrison, director of the National Test Pilot School, invited Maya to join their faculty as an instructor in emergency procedures and crisis management. The invitation represented recognition that her experience offered unique insights into the relationship between preparation and performance under pressure. Maya's emergency management demonstrated principles that apply across all aspects of aviation, Harrison explained. Her systematic approach to preparation, her ability to adapt procedures to unprecedented circumstances, and her execution under extreme pressure offer lessons that every pilot needs to understand. The academic recognition reflected growing understanding that Maya's story transcended individual achievement, representing fundamental principles about how expertise was developed and applied under challenging conditions. Her methods were being studied and implemented by training programs seeking to enhance their effectiveness. The commercial airline industry had taken notice of Maya's performance and its implications for pilot recruitment and development. Several major carriers announced new programs designed to identify and train candidates who demonstrated the kind of dedication and preparation that Maya had exhibited. Delta Airlines created the Rodriguez Fellowship Program, offering accelerated training opportunities for individuals who showed exceptional commitment to aviation excellence through non-traditional preparation methods. The program represented a fundamental shift in how airlines evaluated potential pilots, emphasizing competence and preparation over conventional credentials. United Airlines announced similar initiatives, with CEO Sarah Johnson stating that Maya Rodriguez's example shows us that exceptional pilots can come from unexpected backgrounds, and we need recruitment and training programs that recognize and develop that kind of talent. The industry response reflected growing recognition that traditional pilot development paths might not be identifying all available talent, and that Maya's systematic approach to preparation could serve as a model for enhancing pilot competence. Across all experience levels, Maya's personal transformation from overlooked observer to recognized expert had been accompanied by professional opportunities that reflected both her demonstrated competence and the industry's evolving understanding of how aviation expertise was developed. She accepted a position as chief pilot for emergency procedures training at a major airline, with responsibility for developing and implementing enhanced training programs based on her emergency management experience. The role combined her technical expertise with her understanding of how preparation translated into performance under pressure. Her first initiative involved creating scenario-based training programs that emphasized decision-making under stress, resource management during emergencies, and the kind of systematic preparation that had enabled her own success. The programs attracted attention from aviation training organizations worldwide, seeking to enhance their effectiveness. "We're not just training pilots to pass check rides," Maya explained during a training conference presentation. "We're preparing them to handle situations they've never encountered, using skills they hope they'll never need, under conditions that will test everything they think they know about flying." Her training philosophy emphasized the importance of preparation that went beyond minimum requirements, systematic study of emergency procedures, and the development of decision-making skills that would function effectively under extreme stress. The approach reflected lessons learned from her own experience and observation of what separated adequate performance from exceptional outcomes. The media attention surrounding Maya's story had extended beyond aviation publications to mainstream news outlets, interested in her inspiring journey from dismissed observer to life-saving pilot. Her appearances on national television programs helped educate the public about aviation safety while highlighting the importance of preparation and perseverance. During an interview with CBS News, Maya was asked about the moment she realized she would have to take control of Flight 447. Her response captured the essence of what had made her performance possible. "I didn't think about whether I was qualified or authorized," she said. "I thought about whether I was prepared. And I had spent 3 years making sure the answer to that question would be yes, even though I never expected to need that preparation." Interview resonated with audiences who recognized universal principles about the value of preparation, the importance of continuous learning, and the possibility that expertise could develop through dedication rather than formal recognition. Maya's story became an inspiration beyond aviation, representing the power of quiet competence and systematic preparation. Educational institutions incorporated Maya's story into curricula ranging from aviation technology to business leadership, using her example to illustrate principles about preparation, performance under pressure, and the development of expertise through deliberate practice. Harvard Business School developed a case study based on Maya's emergency management, examining the factors that contributed to successful crisis response and the implications for leadership development across industries. The case became popular with students and executives seeking to understand how preparation and competence translated into effective performance under pressure. Aviation University of Colorado named their new Emergency Procedures Training Facility the Maya Rodriguez Center for Aviation Excellence, recognizing her contributions to understanding how preparation enabled exceptional performance. The facility would train thousands of future pilots, using methods and principles derived from her example. Maya's influence on aviation safety research extended beyond training programs to academic studies of how expertise was developed and applied under stress. Researchers at multiple universities initiated studies of her preparation methods, decision-making processes, and performance characteristics during the Flight 447 emergency. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a cognitive psychologist at MIT who studied expertise development in high-stress environments, described Maya's case as unprecedented insight into how systematic preparation can enable exceptional performance under conditions that would overwhelm most individuals. The research findings supported theories about deliberate practice and expertise development while providing practical insights for training programs seeking to enhance pilot performance during emergency scenarios. Maya's systematic approach to preparation became a model for understanding how competence could be developed outside traditional institutional frameworks. The International Aviation Community recognized Maya's contributions through awards and honors that reflected both her individual achievement and her influence on industry practices. The International Society of Air Safety Investigators presented her with their highest honor for contributions to aviation safety through exceptional performance and educational impact. The Royal Aeronautical Society elected Maya as a fellow, recognizing her achievements in advancing aviation safety through both her emergency performance and her subsequent contributions to pilot training and safety education. The honor placed her among the most distinguished figures in aviation history. These recognitions reflected a growing understanding that Maya's story represented more than an individual success. It demonstrated principles about preparation, competence, and performance that had implications for aviation safety worldwide. Her example was influencing policy, training methods, and recruitment practices across the industry. 5 years after Flight 447's emergency landing, Maya reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an overlooked observer into one of aviation's most respected voices on emergency preparedness and pilot development. Her office at the airline's training center was filled with correspondence from pilots, students, and aviation professionals who had been influenced by her example. One letter from a young woman studying aviation technology in Brazil captured the broader impact of Maya's story. "You showed me that expertise isn't about where you start, it's about how thoroughly you prepare for where you want to go. I'm studying emergency procedures the way you did, because I want to be ready for whatever aviation asks of me." Maya's response to such letters reflected her understanding that her influence extended far beyond her individual achievement. "The most important thing about Flight 447 wasn't that I landed the airplane," she often wrote back. "It was that the experience showed everyone that preparation and competence can develop anywhere, if we're committed to excellence rather than recognition." Her perspective had been shaped by recognition that exceptional performance was possible for anyone willing to commit to the systematic preparation and continuous learning that expertise required. Maya's story had become proof that the aviation industry could identify and develop talent wherever it existed, rather than limiting opportunities to traditional career paths. The airline industry continued to evolve in response to lessons learned from Maya's experience with enhanced training programs, competence-based evaluation methods, and recruitment practices that emphasized preparation and skill over conventional credentials. Her influence on commercial aviation would extend for decades through the pilots trained using methods she had helped develop. Captain Rebecca Martinez, who had offered Maya her first pilot position, reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. "Maya didn't just save 200 lives that day," Martinez observed. "She changed how our entire industry thinks about pilot development, training effectiveness, and the recognition of excellence." The change was evident in statistics showing improved emergency response training, enhanced pilot performance during crisis scenarios, and more diverse recruitment of talented individuals who might previously have been overlooked by conventional selection processes. Maya's example had demonstrated that exceptional outcomes were possible when systematic preparation met competent execution under pressure. As Maya prepared for another day of training pilots in emergency procedures, she reviewed the lesson plans that had been developed based on her Flight 447 experience. The training emphasized principles she had learned through personal experience, that preparation required going beyond minimum standards, that competence developed through deliberate practice, and that expertise meant being ready for challenges that might never come. Her final words to each training class reflected the core message of her story. Excellence isn't about being recognized for what you can do. Excellence is about being prepared for what you might have to do, even when no one is watching, even when no one expects it, even when you hope that preparation will never be needed. The students who heard those words would go on to careers enhanced by understanding that Exceptional performance was possible for anyone willing to commit to the systematic preparation and continuous learning that true expertise required. Maya's influence would continue through their careers, ensuring that the lessons learned from Flight 447 would shape aviation safety for generations. Maya Rodriguez had entered Flight 447 as an overlooked observer, dismissed and underestimated by everyone around her. She had left that aircraft as a recognized expert whose competence under pressure had saved 200 lives and transformed an entire industry's understanding of how excellence was developed and applied. Her story proved that strength didn't require recognition to be real, that competence didn't require credentials to be effective, and that preparation could overcome any barrier when circumstances demanded excellence. Maya had shown the world that quiet dedication and systematic preparation could achieve extraordinary outcomes, not through luck or circumstance, but through the deliberate cultivation of knowledge and skills that would be ready when they were needed most. The morning she had been told to sit quietly and observe had become the day she demonstrated that true expertise meant being prepared to act when action was required, regardless of title, position, or formal authority. Maya Rodriguez had proven that excellence was available to anyone willing to pursue it with sufficient dedication, and that when preparation met opportunity, extraordinary things became possible. Her legacy would continue through the countless pilots trained using methods she had helped develop, the policies she had influenced, and the understanding she had created that exceptional performance was not reserved for those with exceptional backgrounds. It was available to anyone with exceptional commitment to preparation and excellence. In the end, Maya's story was not about flying an airplane in emergency. It was about the power of quiet competence, systematic preparation, and the certainty that excellence was not a privilege reserved for the few, but a possibility available to anyone willing to pursue it with sufficient dedication and commitment to being ready when the world needed them to be at their best. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.